When I used to read comics when I was young, I used to feel that the characters weren't believable, they weren't realistic, because they never had any problems. Their only problem was, how can I catch the bad guy? How can I beat the villain? But I used to think to myself, what about their personal life? What kind of people are they? What do they do when they're not chasing the villain? How do they make their money? Are they successful with members of the other sex? What about their family? Where do they live? And so forth. So I made up my mind, if I do any superhero characters, or indeed any characters, I would like to make them three-dimensional so that the reader can see what kind of lives they live, can see what kind of people they really are, and also can see what problems they have, because we all have problems. Whether we worry about allergy attacks or an ingrown toenail or pimples or anything, everybody has things that concern him or her that they worry about. So I wanted to give these people, even though they were heroes, I wanted to give them little personal problems to make them more believable, to make them more like me, because I've got plenty of problems. What I tried to do was make supervillains a little bit also more human. For example, Doctor Doom, one of my favorite characters. I loved the idea that he was the king of his own country, and if he came to America, he couldn't be arrested because he had diplomatic immunity. And he always thought he was doing the right thing. I mean, all he wanted to do was conquer the world. Now, if you think about it, you could walk down the street and drop some paper on the sidewalk, and a policeman could say, hey, you've been littering, you mustn't do that or I'll write a ticket. But you could walk over to a policeman and say, officer, I want to conquer the world. That's not a crime. There's nothing he can do. Anybody has the right to try to conquer the world. So I guess maybe I tried to put a little built-in humor in these things also, but I tried to think, if a guy like this existed in real life, what would he be like? He'd probably go and address the United Nations because he's a king, and I had stories where he did that. He went to the United Nations. And again, I tried to have fun with the villains, the same as with the heroes. They were menaces, but I wanted to make them interesting. They weren't just bad guys. I tried to give them a little bit of dimension also. The people who read adventure stories want action, not only in comic books. If you went to a movie and you saw Robin Hood, and he was doing nothing but talking to his merry men all during the movie, you'd walk out. You want to see him fighting with those bows and arrows. If you went to see King Kong, and if King Kong was just sitting eating bananas, you wouldn't. I mean, any adventure story has to have action. It has to have the good guy fighting the bad guy. It has to always look as if the good guy doesn't have a chance. The villain always must seem to have the advantage, must seem to have the edge for some reason, because that makes the reader or the viewer or the audience, if it's a movie, it makes them want to watch and see what's going to happen. How is he going to get out of this? How is he going to beat the villain who seems to be unbeatable? If you make the hero look stronger than the villain, it's not exciting. The villain should always look as if he's going to win. Then you worry about the hero and you want to see how the hero is going to win if he can. Personally, I think there's a big difference between violence and action. To me, action is the excitement of the hero fighting the villain and the reader wondering, how is the hero going to win? What'll he do to beat the villain? And it becomes fun. Violence, to me, is anything that when you look at it, you go, ooh, it's distasteful. I would never do stories where someone chops off someone's head. I don't like stories where children are harmed or mistreated. I don't like stories where men take advantage of women. It's hard to explain, but violence to me is something that's very unpleasant. It's something you wouldn't want anybody to imitate. Action is simply putting the hero in a dangerous situation and trying to figure out how he's going to escape and end up overcoming the villain. And they move around a lot, and they're trapped, and they escape, and they hit each other. But that, to me, isn't violent. It's what the readers want. And I think it's a built-in desire, especially with boys, maybe not so much with girls. But, here in America, when boys, when they're very young, they play cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. Bang, bang, you're dead, It's something that just seems to be born in young people. They even today, they have the extreme games. There's an adventuresome spirit on the part of young people where they want to run fast and jump and swim and fly airplanes and jump out of the airplanes with parachutes, and there's that excitement and that stimulation. That is action. Violence is something totally different. The characters usually would be talking while they're fighting. Now, in real life, that doesn't always happen. But I hated to waste all those panels without giving the reader more insight into their personality and their character. And the only way you can do that with a person, the only way you get to know a person is by talking to that person and hearing what that person says. So we had so many scenes with people running around and fighting. I just didn't want to let those scenes go to waste. And it didn't really seem to bother any readers. I think they enjoyed it for the most part. We never had too much trouble with the censors because, as I mentioned earlier, our stories had more action than violence, what I considered to be violence. And we didn't really have any sexy bits that would worry the censor. But there were many funny things that happened. I remember once I had done a Western magazine called Kid Colt Outlaw. And there was one page where Kid Colt shot a gun, and the gun hit the gun in the villain's hand and knocked the gun out of his hand. Very simple, innocuous scene. And the Comics Association sent that page back to us. They wanted it to be toned down. So I said, what do you mean? And they said there was one panel that they didn't like. So I asked, well, what was that? Now, you have to visualize this. There was a drawing of the hero, Kid Colt, holding a gun. And he's holding the gun like this, and he shot the gun, and that was when the bullet shot the gun out of the other person's hand. So in that drawing, you see the gun like this, and there was a puff of smoke and a line indicating the bullet going out of the gun, the way they drew it. So I said, well, what is wrong with that? It was just the gun, the puff of smoke, and a line. And the man at the Comic Code Authority said, the puff of smoke is too big. It looks violent. So we made the puff of smoke smaller. And then it was okay.